Does one of you have access to like social media then to tell people that it'll be recorded?
I do actually. I probably should post that. Yes. Meanwhile, let's get it started with this one here, because it looked the easiest. Tanner, do you want to talk about it?
This is not an easy one. We should do it last.
What? How is that not an easy one? It only has 4 APIs.
There's a lot of complicated topics, and Aaron has opinions on the shape.
Oh God! All right,
so which are valid opinions that we do need to work through.
Then let's do with the announced boring one from Aaron. So Aaron, then tell me why this is boring and uninteresting.
Okay, this is entirely related to WASM. Their start point. All this is trying to do is, if you look at the API usage, what this is trying to say is, on a WASM scenario, what is the target module to link against? That is it. It is not influencing anything else. It has no impact on non-WASM scenarios. It is purely helping to guide how WASM at composition time describes what it links against.
You say what, but there's no data on this attribute. So
in this case, there's like it's implied. So you would just say, so in this case, it would just say use library. But if your WASM component had a different name, for example, I think this is a bad example, but we'll go with it. If you're using something out of libc, that was your name on a DLL import. But if your WASM import had a different name, that's what that would be. And it would override the DLL import. It has
override it with what?
It would override it with its own name.
Oh, okay. The function. Oh. What?
Yeah, so I'm entirely sure what that means. So you're saying basically,
Let me.
So in this example that you have here on screen, where you say DLL import library, and then you say WASM import linkage, that means basically we're saying this one is provided by the WASM runtime, or like what does WASM import mean actually? Holding on to the table.
This is okay. So I'm not wrong. This is a very straightforward situation. Where's my? Can you scroll up?
I can.
Where is this? I should have put more up here.
Oh, so is this something where you have something external to the code, like that statement near the top of the screen right now, that's telling you where this function comes from? And then the special attribute says, ignore any DLL import attribute on this function and go back to that other table.
It's not ignore any DLL import. It's ignore the name in the DLL import.
And rely on this table instead.
And rely on different information to get at it's pure. And if you notice the name of it, it is purely for the import linkage. How am I linking this together on WASM? I have a different set of scenarios. If you look at, I think if you look on that note, the comment to the right, I believe, is the right
one here.
Yeah. This is unfortunate. Here, yes, single accretion actually described it very well.
So remind me, what is direct p invoke again?
Direct p invoke that's the thing that Levi's talking about. That's the description of where does this go?
So direct p invoke, is that a new mechanism that we basically use to map?
That one is part of the build. That one is part of the project, if I recall.
Yeah, it looks like MS build. So basically, does it mean we are basically saying direct p invoke is some metadata that we say like, oh, you set XYZ, but it actually points over here? Is that kind of like a remapping, or what does it provide actually?
There is a simple mechanism for this, and I can't. I'm sorry, everyone.
And it's all fine. It's not that we are always super prepared.
I should have been better prepared for this one.
I just had never heard of direct p invoke. So I remember that Mono had some sort of mapping table for the p invokes, but that might be unrelated.
No, it is. This is part of this. If you look at this, this is part of what is going on with Mono, and we're trying to reconcile this with. Oh, got it. Okay, so go back one, and then click on the. Please see that one for how we got here.
This one?
Yeah, that. So this is where it starts.
If you open this in a secondary tab now.
There's a whole lot of debate about should we just have a different WASM import. The reason we're not doing that is because our source of truth in this case is a set of WASM files.
Right.
So that's why we don't really want to go down that route. Now, there was a ton of discussion, and I believe the easiest description of all this.
So WASM looks like Lisp, is that it?
It does like parentheses, that's true.
Yeah, to me it's a very Lispy vibe. I see. So the only thing I find confusing is like it kind of roughly makes sense to me that you have a different attribute to talk about WASM imports is that there's no name. Because the import has a name on it, right? So I would have expected that WASM import linkage would have some sort of name on it.
This is because of it's coming from
function name itself.
It's coming. Well, no, the function name has some component to it, but this comes from external tooling because this is all going to be generated from a WASM file. Oh, this is the projection into this is what how am I going to call into this?
So this is the code that we spit out when we process a WASM file, and then presumably there's some other attribute that runs the type or whatever that clarifies this. Like I mean, there's a mapping somewhere, presumably, right?
Well, there's the tooling that when you take the .NET assembly and you convert it into the WASM environment,
right?
Like how does my DLL import get connected?
Right.
And so it's coming from a WASM import.
I see.
From the tooling. That's all it really is just it is really just there for the WASM tooling to connect everything together and say, this is how the DLL import should be satisfied from a corresponding export.
What happens with DLL imports that have no corresponding WASM import linkage attribute on them? Are they still legal or?
Well, that is what, if you go back to that one, that was what single accretion was describing. Like, what are the rules for this?
So that was this one here, right?
It's in the same actual issue. It's just farther down.
Yeah, so this is the first bullet basically, right? So if you basically have a DLL import that is dangling, then it'd be throw.
Right, because this is trying to connect what we're converting the .NET to with what currently exists in the WASM runtime to pull it all together.
And so can you describe like what is your reason for not just having the behavior of 3 when you find a 1? You just want to make sure that it's intentional rather than just a bug? Like, why do you need the attribute, basically? Like, why do you want to distinguish a raw DLL import from the other import combined with a wasm import?
Because it's how linkage is occurring, whether it's a part of the WASM runtime or whether it's another module.
I see. Because there's other ways you can link DLL import that is not bound to a wasm import.
Right.
It's not always an error. It's on it's on error when you use the other mechanisms. I see. That okay, I think that makes sense to me now. Now, in terms of naming, why do you say import linkage rather than just import?
Because it was two. So we have library import, we have WASM import, we have JS import. All of the JS, the library, and the DLL have very specific, like they are self-contained. This WASM import is not self-contained. It needs the DLL import, the WASM import, and that's why linkage, because it describes this is a special type of linkage. It has nothing, it is not self-contained. So originally was WASM import. I didn't, my concern there was it is not self-contained at the same level as star import. So let's describe the mechanic of it, which is linkage. This is driving that linkage mechanic.
And you would generally only expect that usage in generated code. You don't expect people to write it by hand. Is that fair?
It's interop, so yes, there is 1% of people that are going to use it. And if you look on that issue, no, well, any of the WASM people, actually we have a lot more WASM people, I think, externally than we do internally. The community's pretty excited about it. The work that is driving this specifically, the native AOT, this is all community driven.
Yeah. Does anybody else want to? Sorry, yeah.
Do we need any entry point parameter? Like if you don't like the function name, you're a hand rolling artisanal WASM p invokes whatever that you like DLL import has it, right? If your function name doesn't line up exactly with whatever the actual export is.
So that's a good question. I don't know. I actually don't know the answer to that. I don't believe that is a concern in this case. And that is, well, all right, let me rephrase. Because this is being generated from a WAT file, like the source of truth is the WASM file. So the name and how it is laid out it's coming from that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but like in your example, right, you're using like both a DLL import and a WASM import linkage or whatever we're calling it. So like, is it not ever possible that you'd want like a different name depending on like where you're building? I don't know. Like,
I don't think
is
so.
the argument you're always like the person generating the C# is always the person generating the WAT?
Yes. Well, say that one more time.
So the person like actually using the WASM import linkage attribute, which is probably a code generator, maybe not, is also in control of like how the WAT is defined. Like, is the idea like you just can force the function names to match up, or am I misunderstanding?
The WAT is describing what this will look like. This is not an independent source of truth. This is either I would like to do this manually for whatever reason, or I have an existing definition and I am projecting that into .NET because that is what I'm going to be calling.
I see. So no one's going to be in a situation where like the WAT was generated by some other person, entity, or whatever, and like need to use this attribute. Like it will always be built together effectively.
I don't necessarily know if it would always be built together. I think they could be used independently, but the WAT describes the contract. It's like the header file. It's like saying this is the name. You can't unilaterally change the name.
Yeah, I'm all for keeping it simple. If you don't need it, then you don't need it.
I don't believe we need it. And if there was, then the DLL import could describe that. Like the DLL import's entry point could still be used. This is just describing the linkage for where is this entry point going to exist? Like, this is just describing the module. This is just like taking care of how do I interpret library?
I was misunderstanding it. I thought this was like some weird like cross-platform scenario, but I guess if it was, or like cross-compilation, but you would if-def and whatnot in that case. So I think what you're saying is making more sense. So the DLL import is not being ignored.
No, it is not being ignored. It is being imbued with additional information. Like, so I guess maybe a more concrete statement is if DLL import wasn't a pseudo attribute, there might be an argument to be made to be putting an additional attribute field on DLL import.
So given that statement, my question sort of leads into that. This is very specifically about WASM.
Yes.
Are there, and is that by design, or, I mean, it really seems like we're sort of saying this DLL import should be treated in a special fashion for this particular use case. Are there other targets where we could imagine like we're going to have another import linkage attribute dedicated to some other target? Should this be, I guess I'm wondering if this should be made more general in some way, or if we're really trying to keep it WASM specific and it is only for WASM and it will only ever be for WASM.
This is a very specific to WASM scenario. I haven't put a lot of thought into the broader like ecosystem. Are there other opportunities or possibilities where we could change this? That's fair.
Yeah, my argument of keeping it WASM specific is if you ever want to describe additional things that are WASM specific, having a dedicated attribute is a good place to put that, right? Versus if you have a general attribute that says, I don't know, DLL import target, and then you have an enum or something, then well, so you have to cook another mechanism to have WASM specific data attached to that, right? And
Yeah.
and I will like put my foot down now. I will assert we will want to do this at some point, because I mean as we're adding more and more, you know, bells and whistles to our WASM integration, we probably want to have more data on it at some point.
And that's fine. It just seems like with, you know, there's that document floating around Swift interop, we have C interop, right. There's other interops. Like it seems like we might be heading towards a point where you have your DLL imports that are sort of categorized as this is the DLL import for X, but not for Y. This is the DLL import for A, but not for B. I'm just wondering if we're going to see more of these show up. Like we're going to see a Swift import linkage attribute, and we're going to see a Rust import linkage attribute, and you know, whatever.
Yeah, I suspect we might, but then I think we also probably find ourselves in a world where we want additional information that. So I don't think it's wasteful in that sense. I think, I mean, there's another question, which is kind of like it seems a bit we are abusing DLL import purely because, well, that's what's recognized by the compiler. It's already embedded the metadata in a certain way, right? But if that weren't the case, presumably we would make the WASM import attribute self-contained, right? And then not use DLL import at all,
right? Well, why does it matter whether it's self-contained or not for something like, I mean,
no, it's just because
we
I feel
control
like
the runtime, we control the target generators. I mean, there's nothing super special about DLL import.
No, there isn't. It just seems a bit odd.
Well, do like all the calling conventions matter with WASM? Like I don't know, but like I assume that there's like a lot of
that's kind of my
things.
point. Like,
no, they don't in this case.
Yeah,
there is. I believe they have their own calling convention, or they use the C ones, and I don't think that they're fully stable. There's a lot of, I'm not entirely up to date on all of that. But yes, the calling conventions that are currently on DLL import, none of them would really apply.
Right.
So is the intent here that, like, if I have a DLL import and I build it in this environment and I don't have WASM import linkage attribute on it, that fails to build?
My understanding is yes, unless you have this other stuff here, right? Like now I have to find and
is that I guess I'm wondering, like, if it fails to build, then
yeah,
why is the
because of how, like, yes, that right there. because of how you're going to actually link this together when you get to WASM.
So basically, DLL import plus direct p invoke would still be valid potentially in WASM because you redirected basically, right, or do something else with it. The only thing that would literally fail is a raw DLL import with nothing else in the system.
So this attribute exists to differentiate 2 from 4 and 1 from 3. That we're flipping a bit somewhere to basically say, is this 1 or 3 or 2 or 4?
I believe so.
Basically, yeah, that's fair. Yes.
Yeah, your reaction is similar to mine, I think.
Can you give any background on like the existing compiler support for DLL import helping with WASM? Because yeah, I mean, I kind of agree that like it seems different enough from like conventional DLL loading that you just like all else being equal, give it a new attribute.
I think my understanding is it's just you can't just have an external declaration, right?
No, you can.
With no attributes on it?
Yeah, you can. That's what unsafe accessors were. Makes me very sad that that exists. Yes. There is part of I think the argument there is that this is a part of the current ecosystem. And this is I can't remember who said it, but someone said like this is the DLL import is already recognized as a thing, and that's what we currently use for like 2. But if we don't use 2, but then if we want to do this other thing, we not only have to get rid of DLL import, but we also have to add, well, we have to use something else entirely instead of just augment an existing DLL import.
So, I think you said it earlier, but direct p invoke, that is something in the mapping file. Is that?
Yes, yes. That is not inside of the C#, inside of C#. That is a part of the, let's say, build chain assets.
Okay, so if I have a DLL import and WASM import, but I don't have that external thing specified, I can't statically link, but I can dynamically invoke. Is that how I should interpret 3?
Say that one more time.
So number 3 is basically saying I have a DLL import, I have WASM import, or ASM linkage, whatever WASM linkage, whatever the name of this thing is, but I don't have direct p invoke specified in that other mapping file. Then I can't statically link, but I can dynamically invoke.
Yes. This is saying link through the WASM import mechanism rather than statically link with the direct p invoke.
And so why, I'm trying to understand why is 1 throw by default throw rather than just be number 3? Like why would I want 1? The behavior for 1.
I don't know.
Because if I don't care about it throwing platform not supported exception and just want to allow it to be imported, then I don't need WASM linkage for that because I could just make the behavior of 1 be the behavior of 3. And then the other cases involve, and they both involve this direct p invoke that is an external specified behavior, at which point that thing could differentiate whatever the bit is supposed to differentiate it. That bit could be on that XML node, which it wouldn't have to be in the C# at all.
But I don't think that you have. Yeah, I don't know this ecosystem enough to push back on that.
I don't know it either. I'm just it feels like we have one too many concepts here, and I'm trying to eliminate one of them.
I mean, it seems to me like one of the arguments in favor of it would be to differentiate just a p invoke that you haven't really decided what to do with versus one where you already made a decision, right? Because if you just generally translate them into WASM imports, then you might blow up at runtime with can't bind foo, and you have no idea where foo came from, right?
Isn't
Because you
one
didn't
blowing up
attempt
at
that to be.
runtime?
Well, like I don't know what number 3 does, but presumably when you have a WASM import, like at some point something tries to bind that to a WASM thing, right?
From the description, it looks like both 1 and 3 blow up at runtime. It's just 1 blows up with the platform not supported, and 3 blows up if it can't find the import.
Yeah, I don't know what linking in WASM means. I would assume it just happens at a different point in the toolchain, but it wouldn't necessarily be at runtime. It would just be your linker that basically says, "Oh, give me the WASM assets for this thing," would not find it and then blow up. But I don't know enough about it. But like that would be the only argument to say like, well, we want people to be intentional about what they want to import to produce better diagnostics. because
yeah.
Today the problem is you import, let's say, a random NuGet package, right? That has a raw DLL import somewhere because it's just meant to run on Windows, let's say, and now you try to use it in WASM. Do you really mean that to become a WASM import? Probably not, right? I'm not sure that throwing PNSE is a better experience, but we could probably potentially put better error messages in there that say, hey, sorry, you have a raw PN row. That doesn't work in WASM, right?
I mean, if the module existed, like how likely is it like that you're gonna have like kernel 32 or something? Like
This isn't kernel 32. This is that module is another WASM import.
no, I get it. I'm just talking about the error scenario where I'm running like an old Windows NuGet package in WASM, and I'm just like, it would still fail to load kernel 32, right? Like it wouldn't be a platform not support exception. It'd be like, I can't find this module, but like that's not too bad. Like
What
I was
happens-
just taking Emo's hypothetical, right? About like running a package that like was designed for Windows.
What happens on native AOT today if I build for Windows and I have a DLL import to libc, or I build for Linux and I have a DLL import to kernel 32? What does it fail at build time?
It can fail at build time if it's a direct P invoke. There's a certain number of at compile time that do that, but there are regular DLL imports that do exactly what you expect, which is at runtime it tries to load the module.
Well, at the end of the day, like if you and everyone else in Interop think this is the right thing to do, I don't know any better. So if adding this WASM linkage thing is agreed upon as the right answer, then the name seems sufficiently scary that no one's going to come across it and try and use it for random things. It feels like, I don't know. It seems strange. Like we don't have one of these for Windows. We don't have one of these for Linux. We don't have one of these for Android or iOS. I don't understand why WASM requires it.
Yeah, I mean, I can express that in the comment, and I'm fine with saying,
You had cut out mid-sentence, just now.
sorry, like, yeah, because I stopped talking mid-sentence.
Okay. That would do it.
That's what happened. So here's the comment. Are we okay with that as a statement?
I can listen. I'm absolutely fine going back and making sure that and educating myself to get more clarity on all the scenarios here, and I can update this API proposal with those answers if that would be helpful. I mean,
for my own edification, I'd love to understand.
Yeah.
As a totally minor thing, linkage, is that like a word that we?
So we originally, I originally had proposed link, And I think Jan suggested linkage. If you scroll up a little bit, there was right there, because he basically said extern C linkage, like that's the term.
I see.
So that's where it came from. I mean, linkage, it's just the classic second phase of the compiler.
Yeah.
So he used that.
All right, whatever.
We needed something to differentiate between WASM import and to modify the WASM import. That's really what it came down to.
Wait, there's also a WASM import now?
No, because the WASM import versus the star import notion, I didn't want that because this is not a standalone idea. It's a modifier, and it's modifying how we link. Therefore, that is where that came from.
I see. But WASM import as an attribute is going away.
It does not exist.
Okay.
It does not exist. That was the original proposal. I had concerns because it was ambiguous. Is this just a standalone as well? I don't want to see WASM import and DLL import on there, or library import.
So yeah, like beyond like what Steve was saying about like us not doing something similar to this for like Unix versus Windows versus Android, like I'm thinking more about scenario where it's like, what if some like random NuGet package is designed for Windows and called like NuGet 32 or kernel 32, but like that seems like a future where as a developer I would love to be able to like define my own kernel 32 functions like in WASM that like polyfill like what this NuGet package that I can't update is going to call, right? Like that seems nice. But just a thought.
I mean, isn't that effectively what this thing here is? Sorry, I can't find it anymore. The direct p invoke, isn't that what it actually provides?
The direct p invoke is what it does the actual link at that. It's more or less the static.
I see. Okay. Yeah, I need to do more research then. But yeah, okay. Now that's making more sense to me though.
All right, so then this very boring and uninteresting feature that took us 40 minutes.
I'm sorry. My bad.
No, it's fine.
No, lesson learned.
Just don't jinx it next time. Don't announce it. If you don't announce it, we're not challenged.
That's on your mood, our mood when you catch us.
Yeah.
It's the same with like crypto and com and hardware intrinsics. Like on a good day, we're just like, just ship it. And on a bad day, we're like, why is this named A rather than B?
You have to schedule it after
days,
hardware
Steven,
intrinsics.
when we no longer have the capacity to care. So what about this one here? I think who can talk to this?
I mean, I can, since I guess that's my comment. But it's an area that I don't super represent particularly well. But the general gist of this is there's a constructor on elapsed event args that takes a datetime, but it's internal now. And we had a request to make it public because people want to be able to create these instances for testing or mocking or whatever. That constructor, I think, has a property that exposes the value of the constructor, but it's only internally constructible right now. Yeah, okay. The signal time property.
Yeah, there's no constructors right now at all, right? So
yeah, so no one can create it right now. What I would recommend doing is sealing this.
Sealing it.
At the same,
yes.
Yeah, at the same time that we add the constructor.
Oh yeah, because you can't inherit from it.
This is because people want to mock system.timers.timer. That's the goal here.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know what exact instance or type they are trying to mock, but I do think the use case was, this type is currently non-constructible entirely, and they want to be able to use this as an input to some, class that says, hey, do something with a elapsed event args, but they can't, call it from the unit test. Mocking aside, it might just be useful to be able to construct one of these as an input to some other class that you want to test.
Sure. I mean, I don't have a strong opinion about it. If we want to make it constructible, fine. This is a pretty legacy. So, but whatever.
I do feel like our event args method derived types should, in general, be constructible by end users, and this would just be one of them. Keep in mind, making this constructor public will be a breaking change to people who are working around this right now. Just FYI.
How so?
What was that last one?
Because the sample code that I've seen that people tend to copy and paste off Stack Overflow whenever people do reflection is they pass binding flags dot non-public without also passing binding flags dot public. So all of those tests are going to break.
You just said several words that make my care factor drop to 0.
Yes. It's something that we've actually broken production applications by making these types of changes in .NET Framework.
Sure.
So just FYI.
Yeah, we broke at least one, if not two apps in .NET 7 when we added a new private member to enumerable. Anytime someone's using private reflection, I don't have a ton of sympathy for breaks. I understand they're wanting to do it. They're welcome to. We've exposed the mechanism for it, but from a support perspective, they're going to have to change their code.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It would be the reason I bring it up is that it might be worthwhile to include a comment either here or in the PR saying if your code looks like this and it's breaking, change it to read this instead. That's what we had to do when we shipped .NET Framework 4.5.
What about people that have a process that tries to build code that constructs an elapsed event arg and it fails, and then they're relying on that failure to drive subsequent stuff in their pipeline? We're going to break them too.
Yeah, I don't think it's a big concern because actually the shape of this internal constructor changed sometime in the past couple .NET releases anyway. It actually used to take a long, and then the constructor would convert it to a datetime. Then it got refactored to just take the datetime. So people already, people are already dealing with this internal constructor changing. So we didn't do anything for that there. So we might as well just do it here, but now they have a nice public API they can call.
Perfect. Yeah, they'll be happy that should be their last break. We keep our promises.
Seems reasonable.
Yeah. So Stefan, I see that you linked to a grep.app search in chat. While that's all well and good, the types of things that tend to result in phone calls to our ICM team are, multi-billion dollar enterprises who see their app suddenly fall over dead.
Yeah, well, hopefully no one's doing this outside of test projects. In this particular case, I would be surprised.
And hopefully those multi-billion dollar companies try building and running before production.
Yes.
But this is timers, so I could totally see them not seeing something going wrong with timers. But yeah.
Well, we have too many timers, right? So there's that.
Well, that's what I was saying earlier. Like the system timer is not a generally recommended timer to use, but if it makes someone's life better, it doesn't hurt us.
Yeah, it seems reasonable. All right. So now, Tanner.
Sorry, actually, one question. Do we care about argument validation? The only way to construct it right now is internal. We know we're passing in good data. Do we want to make do we care if you can pass in any datetime you want? Is there anything that we would possibly validate, or is it just any value is valid?
I would assume the datetime constructor would perform whatever validation is required.
Okay. I mean, I would assume so as well. I was thinking more in terms of, well, I guess we wouldn't want to do that. This is the time at which it was signaled. So, you could imagine if that was yesterday. Well, no. Okay, never
It
mind.
was in the future, but
Yeah.
still, like,
Clocks can run backward.
yeah,
It's fine.
it's fine.
All right, so then back to this one here.
All right, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. And there's no other issues we want to try to get to first. All right, I'll take that as a no. So the premise here is what we expose in what C# exposes, what C exposes, and what many other languages expose for division is a truncated division. So 5 divided by 3, or sorry, 5 divided by 2 ends up becoming 2 because it's 2.5 then truncated. And likewise, -5 divided by 2 is -2 for the same reasons. What some other languages expose, such as Python, but there's an entire list of languages that do it differently, and there's really no consensus across the industry, is they'll expose a different rounding form. The most typical alternative form is floored rounding, which only differs for division, in which case you end up doing -5 divided by 2 is 3, because you're going towards negative infinity. This little detail makes a big difference on how wraparound works when the signs don't match. And there's people that get particularly irked that our remainder operator is remainder of truncated division rather than remainder of floored division, because when they have one that's a negative value, it makes all of their math go wrong. We've had people asking for years, with me pushing back for years, on providing the alternative division and rounding modes. The main reason I've been pushing back is because they're when you know that you actually have mismatched signs and one of them's a constant, there's often a better or more trivial way to do it. But it got enough interest that it eventually went to C# Lang for discussion on whether it should actually be provided by the language as an alternative operator. And given the full set of concerns, considerations, etc., they opted for this should probably just be handled by the libraries. That way we can provide the full set of APIs that are interesting that people have been asking for, so we don't have to add in additional versions of operators to the language, etc. So what's proposed here is we have 5, potentially 6 different interesting rounding modes for division. And we want to give users the ability to have access to all 5 or 6. The 6th one is primarily oriented towards floating point forms of rounding operations for both division and remainder. If you could scroll down a little, Mo. The proposed shape is basically the same as our existing divrem API, which is it returns a tuple, it takes in the 2 inputs, but it then takes an additional parameter specifying the rounding mode, which matches how we've done rounding for other APIs like math.round. There's one particular nuance here that Aaron raised, which is that taking in an enum is not good for the current trimming tooling support. And so Aaron raised the point on whether this should be, instead of one overload taking in the rounding mode, whether it should be expanded out to basically 6 sets of 3 APIs with explicit names like divide truncated, divide floored, divide ceiling, and then divrem truncated, and so on. I think that ends up adding a significant API surface for something that's a point in time issue with the tooling, but I don't feel so strongly about it that I would want to block this on whether it was one set or 6 sets.
So the argument for tooling is so that we don't have to reason about the argument being a literal.
Right. Today, the trimmer has no support for observing that a given input is constant, and then looking at the body of the method and dropping the dead code paths and calling the one function it does defer to directly. It is something that that a reasonably smart trimmer could be expected to support, since basic constant propagation and inlining is fairly standard for such tools. It's just not something it supports today and may not be on the roadmap for it to support in the near future.
So if the linker doesn't,
Which would then mean that the trimmer ends up keeping the full set of 6 and can't trim any of them
do we
because
care?
of the enum.
Like, I mean, how much code load are these 6 operations possibly causing? Like, this is tiny, would be my guess, right?
It's like 5 or 6 opcodes spread across 10 to 12 different primitive types plus int 128, uint 128, big integer. So it's small, but it's small spread across many different types, and that adds up.
Sure.
Like other than the trimmer, which is the reason I started down this, is like the example that was given was Rust. And Rust literally calls out each one. Like if you look at their example,
right. Rust, however, also has the tooling support and language feature support to allow users to trivially take in an input and defer it down. That's kind of what their traits and other features allow, whereas we don't have an equivalent in .NET and C#.
So I'm not following how that's like they have divide floor, right? So they have divide floor. So they have the explicit call. There is no enumeration. So I'm missing what you're getting at.
In Rust, it is trivial to because Rust is kind of a functional oriented language. They have language features that make it much easier to basically take in an enum, defer down to the appropriate set that you want to support. And they have a very minified core lib, expecting most functionality to come from community packages. So they only provide literally the bare bones and expect any higher level wrappers to be provided by the community and the crates. And so the coupling of how their ecosystem works plus the language features they have makes that a good fit for Rust. However, in .NET, we have existing handling for supporting multiple rounding modes. We have existing places and APIs where taking in an enum to simplify things is the expectation. And we don't have the same set of language features that make it trivial to provide wrappers or for users to provide those wrappers throughout the ecosystem in the same manner, where you're providing packages that only give one API. And so for .NET, having an enum better fits our ecosystem and our model and how customers have come to expect our APIs, at least in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, just future consideration, existing prior art in .NET, that's the win. I mean, all the other stuff, I'm not really as sympathetic to. Like the fact that Rust does this, and the fact that, like the statement, I think the statement was made, we're choosing this name because of other people. So if we're choosing names, why aren't we choosing the same API kind of surface? Like that, it just seems like everything is going until it's not convenient. But the argument that we have a rounding mechanism in another API, I can't argue with that. There's nothing there to argue. That makes perfect sense. I didn't realize that we had something else that did rounding.
I mean, You mean like the regular rounding mechanism we have, or
I think that's that's what we were talking about, right, Tanner?
Yeah, we've got math.round, which takes a midpoint rounding mode.
yeah,
That
that one exists I think since WikB, I want to say.
And we notably can't use that here because this isn't midpoint rounding. This
Sure.
is
Division rounding, yeah.
directed
that
rounding.
makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. The fact that we have a rounding semantic as an enum, that's prior art. I'm not going to push back on that.
I mean, I'm not super gung-ho about adding, 3 times 6 or 3 times 6 APIs across, I don't know, 8 types. I'd rather do the 3 ones we see here. Presumably that would also mean they all become public statics on all the primitives, right? So you can say int.divide, right?
Right.
What happened to, don't we have this thing in intrinsics for like, constant expected attribute or whatever?
Yeah,
Or did
and we could mark this as constant expected, just that this isn't actually constant expected, and the wrong thing won't happen if you don't pass in a constant.
Yeah, I guess that's fair. It just means you have some cope load. Potentially, if the linker gets smarter. No, yeah.
Yeah, this is just a right. It's just the trimmer might not be able to trim everything because there's a scenario it doesn't handle today, which it probably should handle, but it's lower priority than other things it needs to support.
Right.
Okay, sorry. Kind of an aside question. What's the difference between truncate and Euclidean? Do they give different results for anything?
Euclidean is doing what is the operation defined there. It's doing, instead of doing truncation, it's doing floored division, where the denominator is the absolute value of the denominator, and then it's taking the and then it's basically doing copy sign of the original sign. So it ends there. There's a wiki page which is linked. It's that first link at the bottom of your screen there, Mo, which actually gives a nice visual graph of the different rounding modes and how they differ.
This one here?
It matters when you do divrem, correct?
Yeah.
More so than divide. If I remember like high school correctly.
Right.
Div and remainder. Yeah.
And so
okay.
Euclidean's the bottom one.
This one here?
Yeah, no, that one's ceiling. Euclidean's the middle one there. And you can see it's got a the stepping isn't the same for the remainder.
Is the idea that divide will always get
And that
the
ends
same
up being
answer
important
towards 0 and Euclidean, but divrem will be different? Is that?
No, I think that's also different, but I'd have to honestly double check. I do not have all 6 of the graphs paged into my head.
Fair. Is there any
that
future
top one
world?
is the existing.
Yeah. Is there potentially a future world where we would ever move these onto a different interface like divisor operations, assuming that floating point can use these somehow?
So we have I-division operations today, and we have I-modulus operators, where modulus matches the name of the underlying C operator, or the IL operator. we don't have them together because you don't always have them as a pair. For example, complex numbers do not trivially have remainder computations available. So they're separate. You only get remainder if you're on I number rather than I number base. There is potential for corresponding APIs to later be exposed for floating point, which is not covered here right now. But floating point has other interesting considerations that have to be done. For example, floating point regular division does not return the integral division amount, whereas remainder does return the integral remainder. And so there's API design questions, and likely a place where we can't have the same set of APIs exposed for both, although they will look similar in shape, just not necessarily in name, to account for that nuance and difference between them.
Okay, so what it sounds like is when that eventually comes online, should it come online, it would not make sense to move these functions down because you would probably have sibling functions to them, or cousin functions, more like it.
Right.
So then, any other opinions on this API?
How does this work with the WASM import attribute?
What?
I'm just
sure.
trolling to extend this.
Okay, all right.
Levi, when are you coming in next, my friend? I have work.
I'll be in tomorrow morning.
Very good. I look forward.
I was staring away from my screen for a second. You said that, Levi, and then I started scouring the screen for what you could possibly be referring to.
Immo, just as to a point for what Tanner said earlier, I think you copied and pasted an existing API into the approved one.
What did I do?
Yeah, the very top one in the interface list is the
Oh, this one here,
divrem that doesn't
divrem?
take a rounding mode is the existing API. Yeah.
All right. Now the fun part.
Okay, so hopefully this one won't be too bad. This is a KMac. It's a SHA-3 API. It's a continuation of some of the work that we did for SHA-3 and .NET 8. The high-level concept of KMac is it is a Mac-like API. If you're familiar with HMac, it does a very similar thing. You know, given a key, compute a Mac over a given message. It has some things that are different about it from HMac, which appear in the API, but lots of similar concepts and terminology there. So there's 4 KMac classes. There's KMac 128, there's KMac 256. There's a variant of those called Zoff further down, and we'll talk about that later. But the API shape among all 4 of them is identical. So talking about how the KMac API works, much like many of the other crypto primitives that we've added since .NET 5, you can use it in one of 2 ways or both. You can either instantiate it to accumulate data and then to statefully accumulate the data and then get a Mac, or you can use one-shots. The constructor takes two parameters. The first one is the key. That one's, I think, pretty non-controversial. The second parameter is called the customization string. And I guess really 2 points on the customization string. That is the correct name. It's what the KMac specification calls it. It's what OpenSSL calls it. It's what CNG calls it. It's what anybody that is looking for KMac would say, how do I specify the customization string? So even though it's a byte array or a span, it is called customization string, kind of similar to how ASN1 calls byte arrays octet strings. The other point on customization string is there is no difference between the lack of a customization string and an empty customization string. So that's useful since it's an optional parameter because the specification for KMac says the customization string is, optional. But a null byte array and an empty span are equivalent in behavior. So if you're using, the byte array one with the optional parameter, and then you switch to the span one and continue to use the optional parameter, it will have the same behavior. In fact, what we'll end up doing for the byte array overload of the constructor is just call the span one and let it do its convert the null to an empty span thing. And we also don't have to do that weird gymnastics we do sometime with, is the span pointing to a null ref? There's the is supported property. Like the other SHA-3 APIs, this returns a bool telling you whether or not your platform has all the pieces to support SHA-3. Like what we did for the other SHA-3 APIs in .NET 8, there's no OS platform guards on any of these things because OS isn't really the right concept for whether or not you're supported. It's your OpenSSL version or your Windows version. So that's just continuing to do what we did with SHA-3 there. We have append data, which is how you accumulate data to collect for your Mac. We take a byte and a span. We have our get hash and reset and get current hash that mirrors again what we did for Shake in .NET 8. What makes KMac different from HMac is its output length is variable. So it doesn't produce, KMac 128 doesn't produce a 128-bit Mac. It produces a Mac that provides up to a 128-bit security level, but you get to pick your Mac length within reason. The spec has a floor on the output length can't be less than 32 bits, but so we take an int for how big you want your Mac to be, or if for the span ones, we will just fill it. The length of the span is whatever Mac you're asking for. The int one is just going to allocate an array, call the span one, and return it for you. Get current hash does the same thing, except it allows you to continue to accumulate more data instead of basically resetting the data that gets collected. And we could scroll down.
Oh, sorry, wrong window.
Maybe. Okay. And then, then we have dispose, which just disposes. And then we have all of our convenient, one shots that already work very similarly to what we did on Shake and HMac. It's the same for Shake, except we take a key parameter in the front and a customization string using a default at the end. The only thing I wanted to point out about the one-shots, if we scroll down, there's a overload of hash data called hash data async. There is you keep scrolling down a little bit. A little more. There we go. So there's two optional parameters here. One for the customization string and one for the cancellation token. I don't really remember exactly what our guidance is on having two default parameters here for the customization string and the cancellation token. If we don't like that, we can use overloads.
Where's Jeremy? So sorry, why is there an async version of this? Sorry.
Because they take streams and it will read from the stream async.
Oh, okay. Makes sense.
Sorry,
And
I upfronted that with a whole bunch of existing knowledge in my brain that, we've had these hash data asyncs put on HMAC and SHA and all of the other crypto primitives. And the reason they're there is because they work on streams.
Got it. Does anyone know if we prohibit it? Oh, sorry.
Well, we've done the two default thing. It makes it a little harder to use the cancellation token. How common is the customization string thing?
It should be pretty rare, but greater than 0.
So I just looked at the one we added for SHA. So why do we have the middle one? Like on the SHA one, we only have the one that produces a byte array from a byte array. And then the one that takes read-only memory does not give you a new array, just fills a provided memory. So
it's more similar to the one if you look at look at the class HMAC SHA-256.
Sorry, which one?
HMAC SHA-256. There's a one shot on that. It's because, and if you look at the statics on that for hash data async.
Yeah, I see it. It's the same shape, yeah. I mean, I don't have a problem with it per se. It's just, it's like 9 APIs for convenience is a lot. But that's...
Yeah, and unfortunately, I'm not unfortunately. I think they're useful, but it's templated off of existing, HMAC and Shake that we've done elsewhere. So there's kind of precedent for all of them existing.
Why is it not a hash algorithm? Sorry, we already went over that.
You mean deriving from the hash algorithm class?
Correct. Yeah, that's what I'm asking.
For many reasons. The first up, and I think Levi will tell you, we don't like deriving from hash algorithm anymore. We stopped doing that. Like the Shake 128 and Shake 256 don't do that. We don't like the polymorphism inheritance for crypto primitives. The other reason is because the API shape doesn't lend itself particularly well for KMAC because KMAC has a variable length output. And two, the design of it doesn't lend itself super well for performance because of the protected things that you have to implement. But the biggest reason that we do it is we don't like any kind of abstraction on top of crypto primitives anymore. That's why there isn't even a common interface amongst all of these KMAC classes. So they just implement iDisposable.
And kind of out of curiosity, I imagine you'll follow the patterns you have for whatever recent hash algorithms have been added. But like with the pen data, does that always like allocate, or does it like use memory pools?
So this depends. The one shots are allocation free. That is why the one shots exist, or one of the reasons. They're ergonomically easier to use. Two, they don't allocate at all, except on, and in fact, for SHA-3, they won't allocate at all because we don't support Windows 8. The stream ones will rent from a buffer, but the instantiating ones where you new it up and then you call append data, the append data itself probably will not allocate. It may need to if No, actually, it won't allocate. It'll just go right down into either OpenSSL or CNG. But the instantiated versions are more useful when you have a lot of data that you're working with already, and you can't just pass it in one single chunk. And at that point, you're kind of already allocating anyway.
Yeah. So to piggyback on to what Kevin said, like I've re-upping everything he said about like we don't like the abstractions. One of the things that the abstractions allows you to do is to change the key halfway through, like which is just a bizarre thing. And then we would need to figure out, well, what does it mean to have a key and a customization string? Does a customization string have to be mutable partway through, and so on? The append data, yeah, it will. It calls down to the OS. The OS does its own memory management under the covers. I think for Mac type APIs, it allocates up front whatever data structures it needs, and then it just. I think this is a sponge function, isn't it?
Yes.
So it should just use the existing sponge data structures under the covers. All of that said, one other interesting thing where you might want to instantiate this class rather than use the one-shots is we're getting some requests for a clone method on various algorithms, so that you can say I want to hash like a kilobyte of data, or I want to add a kilobyte of data, and I want this header to be kind of static amongst all the different hashes that I'm going to compute, and then I want to clone this. From this clone, do A, B, C, D. From this clone, do E, F, G, H, and so on. And having independent instances that you can kind of snapshot midway would facilitate that. That said, we don't have this functionality right now, but it is something that the crypto board has kind of requested we look into.
That's a separate thing, but yeah, we would add that to, KMac, we would add that to all of the existing SHA-3 and SHA-2 and HMAC APIs that we already have. But
yeah, so one interesting thing is that we do have an, I'm going to use our abstraction incremental hash that does wrap a lot of the various hash algorithms. And I wonder if it would make sense to try to tie this into that somehow.
We didn't do it for Shake, and Shake is already in .NET 8.
Right,
at some point,
go ahead.
I said at some point, maybe. The reason why I think that's a little bit of a problem here is if you look at incremental hash, let me just pull it up so I can use the right name.
Yeah, the factory would probably have to be on this type because you need to take things like the customization string and other initialization parameters.
Yeah, the trick is there's like a get current hash on incremental hash, and it takes 0 parameters. So the question is like, how big is your KMac going to be? Because it's a variable length sponge. You can squeeze as much data out of it as you want. So there would be a property on incremental hash saying what its output size is. It would be, or if it's a factory off of this, then maybe you could do it from there, but seems not immediately ergonomic to me.
Right, I agree. It's kind of low priority, which is why I'm not pushing it right now, because it would complicate the shape. And no one's asking for it right now.
Yeah, so the other trickier thing is that's easier in Windows. For OpenSSL, it's a lot more complicated because they have trifurcated their hashing APIs. So the incremental hash would have to have more internal abstractions, but we'll build it if somebody says we should build it. So that's KMac 128. KMac 256 is the exact same thing, except with a different number. Okay, and now we're at Zoff. So same API shape. to explain what this is, in KMac, the size of the MAC that you ask for is part of the input of the hash. If you're familiar with SP 800-108, Levi, it works very similarly. So if you say I want a 16-byte MAC, and you use the same inputs again to say I want a 17-byte MAC, the first 16 bytes won't match because the 16 and the 17 were inputs into the hash function. The Zoff mode turns that off. It basically encodes the length of the MAC as 0 as an input. So that way you can, say, get me a 16-byte, MAC, and then if you say, okay, now get me a 17-byte MAC, and then this first 16 bytes will match. So why would you want that? The interesting thing about a SHA-3 implementation is they are sponge constructions, and you can squeeze as much data out of the sponge as you want. So it means you can have a MAC of any length that you want. So ideally, what you could do then is stream back your MAC if you had a very big MAC that you wanted, or you didn't know how big the MAC you needed is. The reason that we can't actually do that is because OpenSSL doesn't give us the API. So we can say, go ahead and give us the MAC, but we have to basically, we can't stream the MAC back. So that's why the API shape is the same. But the reason why this is a new class instead of a bool on the constructor or something is because in the future, it may make sense for the Zoff mode classes to have new APIs that let you stream back a MAC. CNG lets us do it. OpenSSL doesn't. So this is kind of a bet against OpenSSL or whoever is our next person that implements KMac to being able to add new APIs for Zoff mode later, which would allow you to stream back a MAC or, say, get me this part of the MAC, get me that part of the MAC, etc. But the reason we still have it is it still has value for trying to generate MACs to be compatible with another system that is already generating MACs in Zoff mode. Other than that, the API shape is the same. And rinse and repeat for KMac Zoff 256. For what it's worth, we kind of do anticipate OpenSSL adding the necessary things to do that Zoff. They actually have a couple of open pull requests right now. They've been working on them on and off for a while, but there's definitely community interest in that functionality. So, and there's a spelling in destination error. Okay.
Yeah, unfortunately, you copy pasted it consistently. So.
All right.
Yeah, that makes sense to me.
The only real high-level feedback I have is so Stefan, you might actually note a similarity between like the data protection purposes strings and the customization string being passed as a parameter here. They do much the same thing. In data protection, we require you to pass something even if it's empty. The reason being that the NIST recommendations for the algorithm used by data protection very heavily suggest that you pass a non-empty value there. I'm looking at the NIST technical report for KMac, and I see no such recommendation. So I guess this would be an open question to Kevin. Given that NIST has no recommendation to pass a customization string, you're still good with keeping this as nullable for the customization string parameter?
Yeah, I think so. I have less of a strong opinion on that. If we want to have people pass in, empty, that's fine with me. And I guess if we're saying that, then we, say no more null customization string. You just have to pass in like byte array empty or something.
Could
I
that hurt
don't.
interop? This is for hashing. Like, what if you want to compare a hash to someone else in a different ecosystem who did use null?
There is no difference between null and empty.
Yeah.
Okay, so you just have to be explicit if you want to use that.
Yes, correct. It would be explicit.
Okay.
Yeah, there are some
null would be
APIs
rejected,
where
probably.
there are some APIs that we have that, they're considered optional, but you have to pass us empty to make it a, to make the intent clear that you really are passing something empty instead of null. I could be in favor of saying that the parameters are required, if only because we have existing prior art, although can't think of any within system security cryptography itself like that. But
yeah,
and data protection is a little different in that it doesn't have to like integrate with like any other ecosystem or language. It's just, round trip encryption, decryption, and
right. And the explicit reason that I made that a required parameter, even if you pass an empty, is that the NIST SP 800-108 like very explicitly says you should strongly consider passing something here. And again, I don't see that verbiage in this document. So the only argument I could see for making it non-nullable would be that it is an actual input to the algorithm. And if you're using this as a primitive building block, you should specify all the inputs. But I don't feel strongly about it.
I'm just thinking about how other ecosystems do that. A lot of them treat it as a property as opposed to like an input in a constructor, but we don't really want to expose this as a property. But for CNG, for example, the way that you specify the customization string is bcrypt set property. It's not a hard requirement as an input into CNG. So, and it's the same with OpenSSL. It's a property on the key handle, and not specifying it means empty.
Okay. Yeah, as long as there's no usability problem with leaving it default, like that people will still be able to easily pass in a cancellation token without specifying the customization string. I guess they would use named properties at that point, wouldn't they, at the call site? Or named arguments, sorry.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's an entirely separate thing from data protection, but you could also kind of squint and think of it as the same as the AAD for the AES-GCM class. Like the additional authenticated data on AES-GCM is an optional parameter.
Last concern is in your API usage example, that's if you scroll down to the bottom of the proposal, you have a function called getKMatKey that returns a byte array, and then you pass the byte array and the ROS byte into the constructor.
Sure.
If the key is for whatever reason null, this will do something dangerous. Is that acceptable?
The key cannot be null.
The key will get converted to a ROS byte.
What's that?
The key gets converted to a ROS byte before being passed into the constructor. Are we checking for a 0 ROS byte length key?
If you look at Appendix A of the KMax specification, the key has a minimum length requirement, I think, of 4 bytes, 32 bytes.
0. It says 0.
Is it 0?
Yeah.
I'm thinking of the Mac output size. I suppose much like HMAC, a 0-byte key might make sense then, but
It makes sense, but it's almost certainly not what you wanted.
But I don't really know what you mean about that. It's the local is a byte array. It's gonna because my customization string is a span, so it's forcing it
Correct.
into the span. Okay, I didn't. Okay, now I see what you're saying.
Yeah, so we have seen, at least in one case, a usability problem where somebody was inadvertently passing in a null byte array key, which would have caused the constructor properly to blow up, but where it got implicitly converted to a ROS byte without the caller's knowledge, and then the ROS byte said, oh, it's a 0-length key, that's totally fine. And then it ended up destroying the security of their application because they were expecting to get a runtime error.
So it's the usability
We've
thing.
seen one case of that. It's a usability problem, yeah.
Yeah, so you want an argument null exception for the byte array, but a ROS byte could still have 0 length if you call that explicitly.
It's the whole null to empty span conversion that's a problem.
Seems fair.
This
is like
it's an
PRD,
existing problem. It's an existing problem.
Oh, so, with you said which type has this problem already?
I saw somebody get bitten by this when they were using the HVAC SHA 256 accelerators.
Would it be too breaking to add the null check to the argument null check to the constructor?
Well, they're like, what does a null ROS byte mean?
Oh, you're talking specifically. Oh, I'm looking at constructors where there's a specific explicit byte array overload.
Yes,
you're talking about when there is.
So this constructor has two overloads, right? This constructor has a byte array overload, which will throw on a null byte array, and it has a ROS byte overload. And the ROS byte overload says, oh, a 0-element input is totally fine, because the byte array overload also would have accepted a 0-element byte array. It just would reject a null byte array. And I've seen at least one application internally get bitten by that, where they ended up using where they ended up inadvertently matching against the call site that took a ROS byte. They were intending to pass a key. They had accidentally passed null due to a bug elsewhere in the function, and the null got converted into a 0-length key, and the end result was that all of their cryptographic operations ended up using a 0-length key.
How does that happen though? Like, wouldn't so a span is a struct, right? So it can't be null. And then the byte array would pick the other overload.
Because what happens is you have a byte array key and you're passing a ROS source in the span destination. And that means that the byte array key has to get implicitly converted to a ROS byte in order for the overload resolution to work.
Oh, so we're using a ROS for the, in this case, the customization string, and therefore the implicit conversion happens in the.
Yeah, they were using it for the input and output buffers.
Okay. Okay.
Like similar
so
concept.
It's basically because of another parameter, it got implicitly converted. Okay.
Okay. So OpenSSL does not let you pass in a 0-length key. It explodes in its provider. I don't know what CNG does off the top of my head. We can, the one thing we could do, and I really am not the biggest fan of it, but maybe it makes sense in this case, is basically say, say memory marshal get reference to the span, and then do unsafe.is null ref, and then if the span is null, then is a ref to null, then throw an exception. If you really want to pass an empty key, then you have to pass in like an empty slice. But I think that's not particularly ergonomic. But on the other hand, OpenSSL doesn't let you pass in a 0-length key at all anyway.
Yeah, I would be maybe willing here to say leave it as it's proposed, because you're not introducing a new class of issue. You're just introducing a new way to expose an existing issue. And then maybe if we can figure out a way to solve that first one, we can just apply it to this at the same time. maybe that would be the easiest way to just unblock this going forward.
The implicit conversion of array to read-only span did us so many times.
Yeah.
Nice though when it works. But
yeah, I don't have any other feedback than this. Looks good to me.
Yeah, I kind of almost feel like that class of problem is almost maybe like an analyzer. You know, if that key array, if you have nullability enabled, then that key local would, you know, be byte brackets question mark. And then an analyzer could say like, hey, you're passing a null byte array into a span. Is that intended?
Yeah. Yeah, an analyzer or something might just be the way that we do this, and it would just address this and the existing HMAC stuff that I saw someone get bitten by. So yeah, I wouldn't hold this up based on that.
Yeah, and you know there are legitimate uses for a HMAC with an empty key.
Oh yeah,
you know,
yeah. We use it internally.
HKDF. Yeah.
Yeah. I intentionally have a usage of that in data protection because I'm a terrible person. CryptoBoard was
here first.
displeased. CryptoBoard was really displeased by that, and then they're like, "Well, I guess it makes sense. Sure, whatever." We use ECB, which they were very displeased by, and then said, "Oh, right, there's no other way to do it." Huh. Okay.
See, that wasn't so bad. That was like one WASM attribute of time.
Is that how we measure this now?
Yeah, it is.
Okay, I did post it. It's just GitHub doesn't refresh again. So based on the discussion we just had, I didn't hear any requests for changes, right? Is that fair?
Yes.
I think you identified a typo, right?
Yeah, the only thing is a typo, but that's...
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not as knee-deep in crypto as you are, but why do we have to use ECB in data protection versus presumably CBC, right?
Oh, it's we use it to fingerprint the algorithm in order to determine if two different algorithms actually do represent the same thing. So for instance, AES managed versus AES CNG, how do we know they're the same thing? It's not actually used as part of the payload generation. It's used only for figuring out how to use the key properly. Which is why
CBC with an IV of 0.
Yeah.
Which is basically ECB because you're going to probably only have one block.
That is what we do under the covers, but they're like, you used ECB here, didn't you? And I'm like, yeah, sorry. But it was the right way to do it. Are we out of things to review? Because the very last one on APIReview.net looks short.
What are you looking at?
Isn't it only?
So what was the question?
I wondered if we were out of things to review.
Yeah, I think that's kind of where we are. So we have 20 minutes left. I mean, if we want to, we can look at some of these guys here, but I think we don't have anybody here that can represent reflection. So maybe this is the closest one we have, which probably 10 I can talk to.
What, we can't just approve reflection APIs? It's just us.
I mean, if we want to, we could. I'm just saying, like, usually it doesn't go that way. So might as well.
Latest comment from Steve Harder: moving to future, the ask for "isn't it only" is valid and useful. Yes. Approved. I mean, it does seem useful.
Ten, are you still with us?
Yeah, I was waiting for everyone else to finish talking. So the principle of this API is we exposed. So we've historically had the right-handed versions of APIs. We reviewed and approved and then shipped in .NET 8 a number of left-handed APIs for the other common coordinate system. There's a couple additional APIs that exist where we didn't expose left-handed variants. And users asked if we could add support for those as well. So it's just create billboard and create constrain billboard left-handed, matching the existing convention and naming that we use for the other left-handed APIs.
So help me understand, why do we only have some operations left-handed and only some operations? Like, is the idea that most of them are agnostic, or we only do it for things where we think it matters?
No, so not all APIs are left or right-handed. There's only particular ones where it matters, particularly on matrix. The ones that don't have a suffix are right-handed because that's the way it was done 20 or 8-9 years ago when the types first shipped. And so we just differentiate the left-handed ones explicitly.
That makes sense. So are these all the ones where it matters now, or do we still have some left?
There's potentially one or two other cases that have been missed, but I think this is the rest of them. I had gone through it. It looked like everything was there. There might be one other API that I missed in the set, but if that exists, then we can get to it in the future.
So to be clear, we're talking about just these two methods, the ellipses and the API usage is like saying you could use it, basically, right?
Yeah, I think that's just showing the it's just showing you calling the API. I don't think they even needed to actually provide the example there.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense to me. There isn't much to say, I suppose. I just compared them to the other ones, and they look identical in terms of parameters. So we can take a look at the reflection ones. If we just approve it, I suppose it's fine. If you have questions, I guess we can post them if they wanted to.
So out of curiosity, Tanner, do you have like a quick explanation for like what create billboard is? Like, I mean, presumably it's something with like 3D rendering.
Yeah, so if you've ever played a game and you've seen a bush, and then whenever you walk, the bush continues rotating to face you, that's a billboard.
Got it.
It's a
Yeah,
sprite,
okay,
basically.
that makes sense. In a 3D environment, but yeah, like a 2D sprite in a 3D environment that faces you.
I like your
Yes,
simple
basically.
explanations of these, Tanner.
Basically.
No, that was a good example because I mean, I don't know.
It's
Works
the
for
one-
me. I play games like that. I know what
Yeah.
you're talking about.
It's something. It's something that anyone who's played a game probably remembers, even if it's from like Xbox era games. So.
Suppose is in it only is for the properties that are marked with the init. keyword.
Yeah, init rather than set.
That
Like right now, you look for the attribute, right? Like if you really care. Yeah, doesn't it have an attribute? I think.
I want to say
it's a mod rec.
it's a
Oh, it's a
mod
mod
rec on the
rec?
setter, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, a mod rec is an attribute annotation. So the only interesting thing that I can think of about this would be like if you're using a polyfill system in order to declare the init attribute inside your own library as opposed to the one in private core lib, what does this property return?
Hopefully,
I
the
don't think that
correct
makes
answer.
a property unvaluable. Like the property is still valuable. It's just is a caveat of it going to be that it only understands the built-in mod rec attribute?
Well, it would be
as opposed to
fine,
your own
right? Because
polyfill.
fundamentally, if we add the property after we added the mod rec. So technically, when you compile against the version of reflection that has this property, there's an inbox version of that mod rec. So you should always only see that one, not any one that you define yourself.
No, I mean if you as the person calling this API are probably calling it on a property info that you got from some other library, and that other library might be compiled using a polyfill.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Well, I would hope that we match the compiler semantics in general. It's like if it's name-based, it should be name-based, right?
So we don't tend to match the compiler semantics in the system reflection namespace.
Well, for things that
That
are
has-
language semantics,
yeah.
we should, right? I mean, nullability comes to mind here. We do that, right? Like nullability originally was only based on attributes that are embedded, right? It's only very recent that they made them official attributes in the system runtime compiler services namespace.
Right.
So it wouldn't be, unheard of, I guess.
Yeah, but what API do you use to access the nullability annotations for a particular member?
I forgot, but we added one, right? So
Is it
we actually added APIs for this.
is it directly on member info? I see
No, I
nullability
think it's
info
a
context.
secondary type.
Yeah.
I should know
Nullability
this
info
because
context, is that it?
because I designed this originally, I think, but
Yeah. Yeah, nullability info. Okay.
yeah, something like that.
It's its own separate thing. Mhm. But it's not tied in with the rest of the reflection stack, even though it's in the system reflection namespace.
Yeah, but
the
that I
interesting
think
part.
had more to do with caching than anything else. Like it wasn't that we couldn't do it; it's just that the way this thing was described didn't really fit into the existing signature stuff, right? Versus this one would be easy to add, right?
Well, everything's easy to add, right? Like we just declare the property and do whatever needs to be done.
Well, the problem with nullability is that it wasn't easy, right? Because the problem is that fundamentally at runtime, nullable string and string are the same types, right? So there's no easy way for the runtime type system in reflection to have a property on type that will tell you is nullable, right? So you have to have that metadata somewhere on the side, right?
Right. Sure.
And so that's
we
why
don't
we
have
ended up
is
with the design that we ended up with.
Yeah. But I don't think we have is nullable hanging off of, say, parameter info.
No, we didn't. And the reason we didn't do originally the proposal actually had it there. And then based on discussions with Jan and others, the problem is this would have to cache information, and we didn't want to add that cache to the reflection instances because we felt most people wouldn't care. And so the idea was, well, new upper type that acts as the cache, and then ask that guy the question, and then that guy can cache.
What makes you think this won't have to cache?
Oh, it probably would have, right? But this one is like one property rather than like 6 or 7 that do non-trivial signature parsing, right? But yeah, I mean, it's a fair question. I mean, do we want to have it here? It just seems like, given that it exists in field infos, I wouldn't be opposed to adding it here.
So the reason it exists on field info is that there actually is an honest to God like ECMA concept of an init-only field.
Yeah, it's read
And
only, right?
it's baked into the metadata. Yeah.
Yeah.
So is the mod rec called is external init? Is that what's going on? Sorry.
That's the one.
Yeah. Correct. But it can be defined in any assembly as far as the compiler is concerned.
Yep. As long as they have the right
And
name.
yeah.
I recognize it.
Yeah. And this has interesting this is actually very similar to what Imo was saying about nullability stuff. Like I'm totally fine with this being on property info. I think this API is valuable and this is a simple place to add it. But the reflection stack, the type system, literally has no concept of an init-only property. Like there's no concept of that throughout the stack. It's something that is a C#ism.
So what you're gonna say is like we're not gonna like with this change make reflection start honoring init only. Like it's still gonna allow you to set like via reflection APIs properties that are marked.
Well, it kind of has to, right? Because how else would you do it, right? I mean, if you actually think about how a serializer would honor this thing, well, you kind of have to call the constructor and then call the property, right? So
right, you break the world right now if you prevented that from happening, because that's exactly what's happening in like a lot of deserialization right now.
Right. Yeah, and no one has any desire to break that.
Yeah. But anyway, like I like the isn't it only name, like personally, even if it doesn't match the mod rec, and even if it does also kind of sound like, you know, the ECMA standard fields metadata or whatever it is.
Yeah, so I think there are two conversations here, right? One conversation is like, does the API look good in terms of like this naming, where it lives and so on? And the other conversation is, what does this actually mean? And the first part of it, I think it's fairly easy for me to say, yes, this is naturally where I would expect this to be, and this is the natural name I would expect it to have. The second question, like, what information is this actually telling me? I think is a much more interesting discussion. And I don't know if API review is the right forum for that discussion.
Right, like it is interesting. Like most of the time you're using like reflection to populate properties. You are initializing the thing, so it's kind of irrelevant whether it's a normal stutter or init only. But I could see like potentially in some like interactive scenarios where you're like merging state or something. Like I don't know. Like maybe the thing doing the reflection cares, and if it wants to stop itself from doing something, it could.
Yeah. So is it acceptable for this API to say, or for the API behavior to be, I don't respect polyfills, even though the compiler would respect polyfills? And and for something hanging off of property info, I would say the answer is yes. But the caveat to that is like, then why are you querying it if not to figure out what the compiler would have done?
Like if we could make it work the same way the compiler worked, like why can't
we could do?
Yeah.
I mean, what does the compiler do? Like if I hand wrote some IL and I put in the mod rec, but I didn't have this attribute on it, what would it do?
What the compiler is doing, and someone from the compiler team would be the authority on this, but my understanding is that it's looking over all of the mod recs on the setter, or the property, one of the two, and then saying, does any of the mod recs have the name system runtime compiler services is external init?
So do that. Does anything
does
have a mod rec with the matching name?
So when the compiler imports, I mean, at least on the C# side, I'm pretty sure VB works the same, but no, F# doesn't. But in the general way, when the compiler imports a signature, it looks at everything, right? Mod recs and mod ops, right? Mod ops it doesn't recognize, it ignores. Mod recs that it doesn't recognize, it marks the signature as, sorry, I don't understand the signature, and then you can't call it from C#. So, and then as they are processing those, they're usually bound by name, as Levi said, not by location. at least for all the recently added features. And they do this deliberately because some of them, they want to be able to polyfill, and there generally is no downside to polyfilling, so they just match by name.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like the 99% case would be to like use like there's a public system runtime type or something, or somewhere there's some custom public type that most people will be using, and you could check against that, right? Or you could just check against the name.
Well, that's more like for things that they can't express in signatures, right? So, for example, there is no way you can tell whether the runtime supports ref-only structs, right? So or ref-like structs, and so this is one of those things that we just put a field on the runtime features type, right? Same with like, does your runtime support statics and interfaces, right? But for everything else that is just signature based, like required members and stuff like this, it's just the presence of an attribute or a mod rec on the actual signature, right?
Yeah. Okay.
And as far as the compiler is concerned, you can use init only members if it can find the mod rec, right? If it can find a type with the right name, then you're allowed to use it in the signature.
Right. So it's like looking for the public type, which is like part of core lib normally, which is system runtime compiler services, is external init as a mod rec, right? And like, but it's looking by name. Like it doesn't have to be like in core lib technically, is like the difference, right? Like
that's
it just
correct.
has to
So
have
the
that
compiler has a
name.
write-up of like what types they require to be in core lib and which types they just do name lookup for. And like most of the mod recs or attributes that recently added are just based on name lookup. And then some of them are actually like, if we can't find them, we just synthesize them and embed them in your assembly. So for some, they don't even require them to be resolved. They just say, if you want to use it, we just generate one for you.
And I assume like 99.99% of the time you're using the core lib one. And like for the 0.01% of the time, like we can decide whether we want to match the compiler or not if it's too much work. But like we could.
Well, I mean, you say the 0 point type, right? But like the reality is people do compile for net standard, right? And so in those things is actually more common than you might think. Even in our own code, like all the microcode extension stuff is still baseline for net standard too. So a lot of the stuff ends up happening in our own code for quite a large chunk of our types.
Right, but that's again only for like internal contracts. Like if you're using an up-to-date compiler, you wouldn't typically expose this in like net standard libraries because it would be broken.
But I wouldn't necessarily call this the 0.x% case because it is decently common that we need to design it.
I mean, even amongst the community, if you look at NuGet, there's like at least a dozen packages that literally just contain that as external init class.
Okay. And there's also, what is it, Polysharp? Is that Sergio's library?
That's one of them.
Typically, do they keep it internal and only use it for like internal interfaces, like for nullability and stuff?
Or when the compiler synthesizes something, they keep it internal, yes.
Right.
Yeah. But is external.
I'm talking about the type. Yeah.
Is external init is pretty commonly polyfilled because it's required for records, and people want to use records in down-level platforms.
Yeah.
Got it.
I think to close on this, I think what I would say is we should generally decide how we want to deal with that. I mean, we had this discussion a few times that people didn't feel comfortable using reflection and expose C# specific concepts. I'm of the opinion we need to get over ourselves because the reality is that, 90+% of our customer base uses C#. It is the de facto ecosystem. So even the other languages that exist like VB and F#, they tend to rally behind the C# like concepts because it's the majority of the ecosystem, right? Tuples comes to mind here, right? So F# added support for value tuple because C# didn't use the class-based tuples, right? And so I think we need to decide, okay, whether it's C# specific or not, to me is almost irrelevant because it's more a function of like how important is the concept, and is this a concept we expect people to use in reflection? If the answer to that is yes, then I think we should have first-class support for that. Now, where the line is and how much overhead we're willing to buy into, aka should we add them as properties on the existing reflection instances or have secondary types that allow you to plug in additional language-specific semantics, I think that's a different question. But we are already more than halfway pregnant with the reflection APIs exposing C# specific concepts. That ship has sailed a very long time ago. And I think David Keane had a bunch of examples from the VitB era already. So like it's not something that is a recent decision. But I think the question is, as opposed to doing this piecemeal, I think it might be worthwhile for Steve to just look down, okay, here's all the C# features that he recently added. Which one of them would make the bar? And then how would we go about adding those rather than doing one at a time? Does that sound good?
I definitely think there should be a
Yeah,
reflection
the
API for
one
this.
concern I
Listen,
have over isn't. Yeah, I definitely think there's a reflection API. Isn't it only? I don't think is the right name though, because there is an existing IL definition for isn't it only. That is effectively the definition of read only at the static level. I think this probably needs to mirror the attribute name so that there is no confusion as to what it means.
I mean,
Yeah, and
just different
I
people
put in
will be
chat.
confused. Like you'll be less confused. People who are like just probably your average C# developer doing reflection might be more confused.
I put in chat just now what the type name
If you're
is
doing
looking for is
reflection,
too.
you probably should read the docs a little bit. I
mean,
think
you
if you're
could
doing
say that
reflection,
both
you
ways.
probably need to do some doc reading. Well, yes, but this is all reflections in advanced scenario. It's fundamentally more advanced than your typical C# and the definition reflection in general so far today has mirrored the IL concepts greatly in most cases. Because
done,
it's not
unfortunately,
C# specific,
both,
it's
and
IL
sometimes
specific
to high
across all
confusion,
target
right?
languages.
Right, like nullability is kind of one of them, right? That you were talking about, like
One,
kind of
one,
matches.
I
what
mean,
C#
there's other
semantics.
examples. If you, for example, look at parameters and you ask simple questions like, is this, in, out, or ref? There are properties on those things that give you that information, but they don't match the C-sub notion of ref. And so people are very confused by that sometimes. They're like, well, this says it's by ref. It's like, yeah, but that means something very different than what you said in C#, right? So there is a lot of that. And I think that's, whether that's good or bad, that's the reality we live in with reflection, right? But I think it is a fair point to say, hey, how do we decide on naming when there is a conflict between something that exists in IL and something that exists in C#, right? And I would not necessarily say we have to go with the IL one, but I think we need to have a goal of like minimizing confusion and understanding that the reflection APIs are still somewhat used to look at the actual thing, right? Rather than some language specific projection of that thing. But I think for most people, the canonical representation or
Right,
projection is
but in this
IL.
But in this case, we have field info, isn't it only, which is the IL concept, and that's why it has the name. Whereas this is a unique concept different from the field, isn't it only, which means that it can be externally initialized from the constructor by things that support that.
I find it very ironic, and we're over time, that we're debating about whether or not we should introduce C# or IL concepts into property info, which is like purely a property is a C# concept. Like, right? Like it's methods in IL.
No,
There's
it's an
an
IL
ECMA
concept.
concept.
It is 100% an IL concept.
Oh, okay. Well, that shows how
Properties
much
exist
I've
in
looked at
metadata.
it.
They're because basically what is an accessor and what is not is actually expressed. You can't just have a method
Really?
set underscore foo and then expect to see a projection to foo property. You need to have an entry property table.
I see. I honestly thought it was pure convention on the methods.
No, it is not.
All right. Well.
Is it within the realm of API review to say like these fundamental types in the system reflection namespace, type, property info, parameter info, blah blah blah, should purely reflect ECMA and IL and nothing language specific, and all language specific stuff should go on other types instead? Or do we really want to defer that decision to like the area owners?
I would generally say like it's an area owner thing. I mean, we can have opinions on this, I think. And I'll happily submit that I have opinions on this, but I think fundamentally, I think the reflection owners should express a proposal. Like what I'm concerned about is doing this piecemeal, because then we will make very inconsistent decisions. And I think we should probably also do an inventory of what we already do, because I don't think we live in a world where the reflection core types are purely ECMA. I think we already are in a state where we have exposed language-specific projections effectively on those types already.
I think you're right. I think in some cases we've exposed
Yeah.
concepts that are used by like the p-invoke stack, or com. So I think that might be why things like in, out, and ref do have some special consideration in reflection,
Yeah.
because there are runtime behaviors that are contingent on it.
Notably, those were also ECMA. Yeah, and notably, those were also ECMA specified behaviors.
Yes.
Some of them are, not all of them are. Like, for example, default values, I think, doesn't exist in ECMA at all. It's just a convention by our custom attributes.
Nope, default value fully exists in ECMA, and that's how it's a specially encoded attribute. It's one of the magic attributes. Optionals and defaults are fully ECMA specified.
Yeah, I might misremember the specifics, but there are examples where that's not true. I'm pretty sure there are custom attributes that don't exist, that have special meaning in C# and are exposed by reflection already. I forgot which ones they are, but I'm fairly certain that that is true. But that's fine.
And
I
did we
think
expose
just
them
because we have
using
been
C#
inconsistent doesn't mean we should
terminology
continue to
that
do
differed from the attribute?
So what was that?
I was asking, are those that we have exposed that are C# concepts, did the name of the underlying C# attribute in metadata differ from the name of the public C# concept? So in this case, the C# concept isn't init only, it's external initialization, which is a feature of records.
No, I think that's a different question, right? So like to your point, like if the mod rec is called is external init, I'm fairly fine with calling it that. I wouldn't have any objections to this. I think the objection I've seen in the past is we shouldn't expose it at all and just leave it to people to just crack open the metadata directly, because it's a C# specific concept, not an ECMA specific concept. And that one I think I'm less clear on. And I think that comes back to like, okay, how do we think
Right.
about
In that case, I think it's I think that's a case where it may not have a specialized encoding in ECMA, as in it's not a magic attribute, but it is something that is so that because C# is the main language, it becomes an interop consideration for other languages and for anyone using the reflection stack from a correctness perspective, including for things we expose or ship in the BCL. And so it's still important to expose those concepts, but we should expose them as convenience over here's a friendly way to do, does this attribute exist on this particular thing?
Yeah.
And in that case, it can be something like is external init, because we're literally checking, does this have the attribute is external init? And it's and reasonably we could do the same for F# concepts if they were common enough.
So
and they had a core attribute we're shipping in the BCL.
Right.
Like my perspective here is there are a lot of people writing reflection, including myself, who clearly are not like the biggest IL experts. But like, I would immediately understand what property info dot, isn't it only meant. The question is, like, if I was like you, Tanner, and like assume you weren't on the API review board and I knew like IL inside and out, like could it mean anything else? Like, I get that it's the same thing used for like read-only fields in IL, but like it can't be that, right? Or
yeah, I mean, personally, I don't have anything against is init only either, right? Like, I think the argument that Tanner has is not insane, right? I think the argument you could make is, well, there is no IL concept for is init only for properties. that is expressed as this new thing that happens to be called like is external init or something, which is fine. I mean, that's one of those things where it's like, well, yeah, the name is potentially confusing if you know too much, but then if you know too much, you probably can reason about it why it has the same name out of like simplicity reasons.
That's basically my argument. Like the only people who would be confused are too smart to be confused by it.
I think the issue is that it's not just a people who are smart enough to know the difference can figure it out. It's also we have an existing property with this name that means something else
on field info, but it's like similar.
And a reasonable person might expect, and another perspective might be, isn't it only is something that's exposing whether the underlying field for an autoprop isn't it only. There's many ways you can view it as how could it be on a property and mean the same thing as the other isn't it only definition we have.
Yeah, but we don't need to design it here. But I think in general, I think I'd be okay with a rule that says whatever the underlying names are that we embed in metadata is probably the names we should use on the reflection APIs, because, well, if we already decided that the modrec is called is external init, why would we call this is init only, right? That makes no sense. At that point, we should have called the modrec is init only, which we didn't, right? So if we want to talk about metadata, then I think it's fine to say like, yeah, whatever the underlying mechanisms are, that's what we call the concepts in the reflection APIs. Seems like a reasonable starting point, right?
Yeah, I would argue that reflection APIs are like more visible than modrecs in the IL. Unless you happen to be like, looking at it. I don't know. Like, obviously.
Well,
it's degrees,
the thing
right?
is that a modrec is something that if you're working with reflection, you fundamentally have to understand. That's what the modrec means. If you don't understand the modrec, you aren't allowed to call the API.
You can totally use reflection without.
No, that's the definition of a modrec. If you can, but that's a violation and you're now in unsupported territory. And if you call Microsoft support and you're doing that, we are allowed to say, don't do that by.
Yeah,
wait, I'm not sure what you're talking about here. Like, you're saying that people who like would want to use this property info API would like need to understand modrecs to use it. Why? Like,
that's the definition of a modrec, right? Modrec means a required modifier. So the calling convention is, unless you understand what the modrec means, you're not supposed to call the API, because you're not able to reason about what the requirements of the API are, because you didn't validate it correctly.
Well, that's funny, because like every like deserializer ever does that. So like, right?
I mean, to some extent, yes, but like that's why we work really hard to make sure we can poison APIs correctly when we think that will be a common pitfall, right?
I don't think I've seen any deserializer fail because of the init only modrec, unless it's been source gen, in which case it's the C# compiler.
Yeah, but I
so
think
like whatever people are supposed to be doing, people are using their API.
The point of it is that it can fail. So, for example, if you have a static read only and you're accessing the property and you call the init method, the runtime will fail you because you are trying to modify a via reflection, something that is considered static read only and that the runtime is making optimizations around. And so there's actual runtime support for is external init and allowing that to be used outside of the constructor or from the constructor in a called method in limited scenarios. Like this is actually runtime supported without us versioning the metadata. So it is functionally a magic attribute in the same traditional sense as other magic attributes, just not with a special IL representation.
Like, by your argument, shouldn't
we very much APIs are in undefined behavior land.
Wait, but like based on your argument, like if we really felt strongly about this, wouldn't like the property setting APIs and reflection, shouldn't they be like, oh, I see a mod rec I don't understand and fail? Like
No,
what?
because it's the mod rec is on the return value. So the idea
Yeah.
is that, and I wonder if that was intentional to avoid breaking things like serializers. I'm not part of the LDM. But the thing is, if you get the set method on an init only property and you look at the return type is not going to be type of void. It's going to be type of special void. And that's the thing that if you're using normal reflection on, your code will fail. Because your
But
code won't know
not
what
the
to do with
property
type of special
info
void.
setter APIs. It's only if you like go out of your way to find the set method and then look at the void return. What?
Right, because the set APIs aren't looking at
Right,
the return
so-
value.
Right. So if you actually create a static read-only field of a type that has of a value type that is external init on its property, and then you try and call that set method via reflection, the runtime will throw.
So only for wait, but that's if it's a static read only. That's like conflating things, right? I thought we were talking about
That's
init only.
if that's if
properties.
it's a static read only, and for other. Yeah. So you're calling a property setter. That's what the is external init is for. It's for the setter. You're calling that setter on something that's a static read only field. That will throw at runtime for value types. For reference types, it won't throw because it may or may not throw, and the runtime is allowed to validate and throw in some cases. Same for other init only fields, properly init only fields, as in the IL concept of init only. Once you're modifying a read only field, you are in undefined behavior territory, and is external init exists to say you are allowed to modify that field within the concept of I'm calling it from a constructor, and therefore it's not been locked by the runtime and potentially put into immutable memory.
Right. Like, I mean, if you had a setter that tried to assign to a read-only field, it wouldn't matter if it was init only. It would always fail, right? Like the init onlyness wouldn't, like at least the C# is external init onlyness, I guess, to be very clear. Like doesn't change that, right? Like today, the only thing that would refuse
It depends, and it's undefined behavior.
Right, but today, like the only thing that cares about the is external init mod rec is the C# compiler, right? Like we don't know of anything else that like gives to.
No. The runtime cares about it in some capacity.
It actually like makes decisions
Because the
based
runtime
on
uses it to understand when it's legal to call that on a because it uses it to understand whether you can call that property setter on a static read-only value type, for example, where it does currently throw otherwise if you were to try and call it outside of the constructor.
Okay, so I have a property, so I have a property that has a type that has an external init setter that I assign to a static read-only field. That's the scenario. And then I'm trying to call that setter.
Sorry, I didn't have any audio for some reason.
You're trying to mutate memory that the runtime has specifically protected.
But wouldn't like any setter fail? Is that
It
because
depends.
of the
Is external init says that I'm mutating. Yeah, because is external init is a special property that says I'm allowed to mutate this because there's something higher up that has validated that it's only doing it from the constructor call. and therefore it's being done before the memory has potentially been marked as immutable. It's just like string.create that takes in the delegate callback and allows you to mutate the backing allocation for the string before the GC actually marks it as immutable and prevents you from mutating it.
Okay. Oh, there's a sharp lab.
Yeah. So this API was not approved, correct? It was marked needs more work.
Wait, that's not this.
That's right.
So it sounds like you're saying that the is external init modrec takes off some of the guardrails because it assumes that the caller like checked that it was being done from the constructor. Is that what you're saying? Like it takes off some of the runtime guardrails?
It takes off, yeah, it takes off some of the guardrails because it's a modrec, and the expectation is you're only calling if you understand that modrec, and therefore you are following the rules of it to prevent the undefined behavior.
I see. So there are other things that assume that you're following the modrec, but there's nothing else other than the C# compiler that we know of that actually follows the modrec.
Every language compiler is supposed to. So the
But,
problem
like,
is that the
F#
runtime
can
doesn't
set it, right?
necessarily do that because it has no real good way of doing that, right?
Right. And like reflection certainly lets you do it. Anyone who's like doing reflection without going out of their way to check the modrecs, which is literally everyone, like gonna be fine setting those properties.
If they are doing it, then they're an undefined behavior, and a sufficiently smart runtime can fail at any point in time. The second you call that without following the modrec rules, your program can delete your entire computer and throw it in the dump.
Well,
It's
I'll
allowed
let you
to do
make that change and deal with the support as like that break system text JSON and like everything else when you're not doing.
I mean, to
shit.
be clear, right? Like we know the F# compiler doesn't do that, by the way. The F#
Yeah.
compiler ignores modrecs it doesn't recognize.
Exactly.
So there are
Which is
cases where we
bizarre.
don't follow those rules, but like that was the
and
intent in the
that's been a
ECMA spec.
problem.
That's why we basically have modrecs and mod opts. And mod opts are the things is like, oh, if you don't understand them, it's fine. And modrecs, if you don't understand them, you can't call the API. And of course, understanding a modrec means there might be other rules you have to follow, right? That are coded elsewhere, right? So that's for the specification.
Yeah, I just find it funny, like Tanner being like, anyone ever who's used system reflection without like checking all the modrecs is unsupported. Like maybe, but like that's all of our customers, like everywhere. We were talking about the private reflection for the tests of like adding.
I mean, that's not how support works, right? Like support, it doesn't mean like, it's not like, oh, you didn't follow the law, therefore fuck you, right? It's usually more like, well, here's how the system is supposed to work. You're violating those rules. Therefore, the system behaves as intended. We recommend you change it, right? And in some cases, you might decide to ship, other bug fixes that throw earlier or do something else and don't format your hard drive, right? But like,
right, and we're not.
There are plenty of other
advice.
cases people follow the rules and we still don't give you support because we're like, yeah, sorry, we don't care enough about to fix this, right? So
like the reflection APIs for the property info setters could have
We're
always looked to see if there was modrecs that it didn't understand and thrown, but it never did, and it doesn't. And like, because we don't follow our own advice, like, clearly.
No, but it's
We're
not.
not
It's not so much
actually
that
going to
reflection
be-
doesn't honor it. It's just deflection has no way of honoring that. Like,
Okay.
what would it look like in reflection to honor is external init? Like, what does it even mean?
It would mean like when we introduce the feature, right? Like that we'd make it impossible to set these things with reflection. We intentionally made it so it's not. Like when we introduce like init only properties in C#.
Right, but that would not be
the modrec
useful,
in a
right?
way.
Because
Yeah, exactly.
you kind of would say, well, if I deserialize, the semantics you want is to say, well, deserialization only succeeds if will succeed with those things set, right? Like because they are like in the payload, right? So they're the same as the property initializer syntax would be in C#, right? So like you kind of want that to work.
Right. So we literally designed it around this quote unquote unsupported usage, which
and
is just like
not
okay,
that calling
sure.
them ever.
Well, it's more like that we said that
It's not that calling them
people that
ever
use
is
reflection have to
unsupported. It's
honor
that
it, right?
calling them outside the rules.
Right.
Right, which I mean is literally like everyone, right? Like, because everyone's calling it outside the constructor if they're using like reflection APIs for the most part, and no one's checking for modrecs. And it was designed to continue working. Like, we didn't want to break serializers. So to say like it's or deserializer. So to say it's unsupported is like silly. Like, we designed it so this would work.
Well, I mean, it is supported in the sense that, you know, it's basically saying like, you know, the runtime doesn't fail the load of an assembly that violates the rules, right? The answer to that is, well, the compiler was supposed to check that. You're not supposed to get a binary with that. And so every language compiler is supposed to honor that, right? In the same way that the contract is, if you use reflection, the people that use the reflection code are supposed to inspect those and encode them as part of their rule set, right? Which you can totally write a JSON serializer that says, well, I do honor those custom attributes, right? And we generally do that in our serializer, right? It's just that, you know, we don't follow it in the sense that we blow up at runtime with, sorry, there's a mod rec I don't recognize, right? But we totally could do that if we wanted to. It's a fairly expensive thing to do at runtime, which is why we don't do it.
Yeah, I'm saying like it's super supported to call like property info set on like a thing that's modrect is external in it, because like it happens all the time. Like, whether it's official or not, like we're never breaking that, right? So
yeah, it's just that when somebody complains and says, "Hey, I bypassed
We've
my type
definitely
safety," it's
broken it in
like,
the
well,
past.
don't do that then. It's like the same with like like what is the thing we just added? Like the private accessor. It's like, yeah, you can do it. It's not going to be like, but you can break the type system by doing that. And so it's supported, but like it doesn't mean that every use of it's going to be supported. It's like, well, you just broke the runtime invariance by arbitrarily setting private fields in our types. So like, no, we don't support you.
Is
Okay.
one
Right,
mic
so, like,
working now?
I think it is.
so.
Yes.
Okay, yeah. So the point is that officially it is not supported in the same way that targeting C#12 on .NET Framework is unsupported. Power users can technically do weird things. They can work around the invariants. They can make it work. But working and being supported are two different things. And we can do and have broken those invariants in the past and told customers, you were not following the contract, get over it. One of the biggest cases we did that was when we made it so that mutating a string via p invokes was fully blocked. When we made it so that mutating a string via reflection was fully blocked, and the runtime will actually block the reflection API from being invoked and trying to do that. We similarly blocked setters from being called on static read-only fields in like .NET Core 1.0 because we wanted to depend on that invariant and do optimizations that were more meaningful than supporting the customers doing bad things. In the same way, is external init has a contract. We expect users to follow that. There are many people who do not follow it, but we are free to break that if we determine there is enough benefit of us doing that. If we can do significant optimization works, if there's security work that's needed, etc. We can and will follow that invariant and tell customers you were doing the wrong thing. Don't do it. Do something else.
So I'm just saying, you know, someone who works with like a lot of customers in ASP.NET who are already like using init for a lot of things that are getting deserialized by a lot of libraries, that like you're fooling yourself if you think that ship hasn't sailed and that we can actually break this behavior. You can use reflection and property info set to set init only properties, and like
in some
we can't
cases
reasonably change that.
we already have in some cases and did a lot of that in .NET Core 1.0, and we can and will do it again in the future if there's enough benefit.
I hear what you're saying about 1.0. I'm just saying for init only properties, like I don't think you're being realistic.
We already did it in some capacity in Core 1.0
when we didn't have init only properties. But anyway,
we blocked calling setters, regular setters on properties for static read-only fields in Core 1.0.
Okay.
I mean, just because we made breaking changes doesn't mean we keep making them. Because it's always a trade-off, right? How many people are doing it? What's the blast radius of making those changes? What's our benefit of making those changes, right? And so it's going to be degrees. I mean, we don't make API breaking changes, yet we have a proposal to remove binary formatter, right? So like it's like these things are not fundamentally at odds. It's all about, okay, what's the cost benefit for those things, right? And for init read only, like, oh sorry, for init properties, it's like, well, the intent is when you use a serializer, it's like, well, it's fine because you get a completely fresh instance and the serializer set it, so it's fine, right? It's just that once you have an instance floating around and you arbitrarily use reflection to set properties on that, that to me is in the same realm of like you're using private reflection. You're bypassing the rules of the system, and yeah, you get whatever behavior you get by doing that, right? And if it works for you, good. If it doesn't work for you, then too bad. If we change a behavior that no longer works for you, well, it's probably like a type by type thing, right? If the type is frequently used and frequently modified, maybe we can't make that change, right? If it's a rare type, maybe we can, right? So it's going to be one of those things where there's gray area, and we will use judgment to evaluate that, right?
Right,
Yeah.
and that's
I
my
just
point.
object that property info is designed for people who have read like the ECMA spec, and that there's any pragmatic or semi-realistic snowball in hell's chance that we would ever like start punishing people for not checking that mod rec, because like
I mean, we already do for native AOT and stuff. People who are using reflection in bad ways fail for native AOT. They fail IL verification. They fail other tools, and that blocks them from scenarios.
I mean, what is true is that reflection has always been a mechanism by which you get to bypass the rules, right? And so in that sense, reflection was always a power tool that has sharp edges, and we have basically said, yeah, if you use private reflection and you poke around in things, it's hard to support you in that scenario because you arbitrarily patch the runtime, basically, right? And I think that the challenge is that people very often do these things without realizing that's what they do, right? Because they use a custom serializer, or they intend to do this one thing, but they do actually other things, right? So yeah, I don't expect our customers to read the ECMA spec to use reflection, but I also have no problem with telling people, like, when they use reflection and bypass an entire subsystem of the runtime by doing that, it's like, well, sorry, we did not defend against that. I mean, it's still your process. You get to send any arbitrary things, but it doesn't mean that the end result is always guaranteed to work, right? And
right.
so
So
it's
like
going to be degrees, right?
what we're trying to do, right, is like make it for people who do want to follow like the spirit of the mod rec, right? Who are
Yes.
potentially like mutating objects that are already out in the world, and like they don't want to edit the property if it's init only. And for those people, like, yeah, like I just disagree with the audience. Like a ton of people write like reflection code who are not like C#/IL experts, and like we should make it easier for them to actually follow the mod rec, which means calling it a thing that they would know what it is.
Yep.
Notably, we do respect is external init in a lot of our own modern serializers, including system text JSON, because it's necessary to support it, because it can fail in some scenarios if you don't.
Yeah, and I agree, and that was fixed, I think, in 7. It was after it was first added, right? The mod rec, but even then, right? It's technically after the constructor. It's just before they've handed the object to any other piece of code.
Right. It's within the realm of what was defined as legal from the C# perspective.
I think probably init is probably the lesser interesting one. I think required is probably more interesting because you kind of have to do custom logic to honor that. But that's an example of something where, again, I don't know how reflection could really help you there unless we create a completely new way in reflection how to construct an object that looks closer to what the C# object initialization is, where you select the constructor, its parameters, and also a bunch of properties, right? In which case we could actually fail for certain things later, right? But that's potentially not necessarily what you want either, because if you write a serializer, you might want to stream. So you may not actually want to do this special API. Maybe you do want to construct the object and then set properties later and then check a flag or something, whether you saw all the required ones, for example, right? So just because we have these things doesn't necessarily mean that they are the right shape for every consumer, in which case, well, we're probably better off just surfacing is required somewhere and then say, sorry, you're supposed to check that. You haven't in the past because it didn't exist in the past, but now you kind of have to, right? And I think that's a general problem with type systems, I think.
The way required works is the constructor gets called, and then you're supposed to call and any of the setters on required properties before consuming the object, basically immediately after the constructor before doing other stuff. And so logically, you'd expose required as type dot, get me the list of required members. And then you'd call the constructor, you'd iterate through the required members, initializing each one, and then you'd move on from your reflection code.
All right. Well, I mean, I don't think we're approving this API today anyway. I mean, it sounds like there's disagreement on the name. And for that reason, this is long. You guys can keep talking, but
I need to go as well.
Yeah, see you guys.
We're overtime anyway. We have 40 minutes overtime. So
I know. All right. Later. I have some .NET Conf prep. Yeah.
Enjoy the lunch.
See you.
Bye-bye.
See, now Aaron should feel better.